we'll start recording, or I guess it's being recorded now, but we'll at the hour, we'll start promptly and then try to finish up roughly on time.
Yeah.
And there is a smaller group that's gonna after this, they'll be divided into there's a subset of people who've cooked up their specific aims, and there's a separate Zoom link that mentors and mentees will enter. So, but
And should I go to that part?
you know, if you're interested in checking it out, you're more than welcome to. It's basically going to be 7 subgroups in a Zoom room.
Yeah.
If you had time to kind of poke around and check it out and observe, that's great. But I know, I mean, you're in Vietnam and you're
I'm
it's
actually
totally up to you.
pretty exhausted, so I'll if I just mostly wanted to check that I wasn't expected to be there.
No, not expected. And we'll share the report with you afterwards.
Yeah, that'll be great.
So I'm going to go ahead and launch in. Thank you everyone for joining us today. We have a real amazing guest, Professor Bill Miller. He's at the Ohio State University in the Division of Epidemiology. Dr. Miller has talked about grant writing. I saw him talk in China. I know a couple of months ago he was doing the same or similar series in Malawi. He's really an expert on thinking about grant writing, but not just thinking about it, doing it. He's a really accomplished grant writer and scientist, and we're thrilled to have him with us today to kick off this series. Just a few housekeeping measures. You'll notice this is a webinar series, so if you have questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A section. There should also be a little bit of room at the end for additional questions. And if you have any questions about the Grant-o-thon more generally, there is the website. We'll put the link to the Grant-o-thon website and the notes on writing research grants that Dr. Miller shared a useful PDF that will also be on the website. So without further ado, over to you, Dr. Miller. Thanks again.
Thanks, Joe. Appreciate it. And as Joe said, I've been teaching grant writing for probably 20 years now, in various forms to various groups of people. And it's a pleasure to be here to do that today. Why am I not advancing? Come on now. There we go. So just a brief note about terminology. So the U.S. National Institutes of Health uses the term specific aims. Other agencies may refer to things like research objectives or research goals or something similar. But regardless of what terms are used, the principles are really the same. I'm going to use the term aims or specific aims interchangeably. And when I use those terms, what I'm really talking about is the first page of a grant proposal. That's basically an introduction and then the statements of what you're going to do. And I'm also going to refer to aims statements. These refer to the one-sentence descriptions of the proposed research, and they usually begin something like to describe or to assess or something like that. Before you start working on your aims, you really have to have a very clear research question. And that research question must be interesting. And first of all, it has to be interesting to you, because if it's not interesting to you, then it's going to be very difficult to write. And especially it's going to be very difficult to write a full grant proposal. And it has to be interesting to the scientific community, because if it's not interesting to other people, no one is going to provide you with funding to do what you think is an interesting research question. It also has to be focused and it has to be feasible. And I'm going to talk more about those aspects in just a moment. So there are various ways to refine your research question or put them into a framework. And I've included two here, which work quite well and are in many ways complementary to one another. Both of them are acronyms, so you can refer to the FINER framework. And the FINER framework means that the research question should be feasible, interesting, novel, ethical, and relevant. So whenever we talk about feasibility, that means that the what you're proposing to do has to match the amount of funding available. And it's quite common to have bigger ideas than what the funding would allow you to do. And again, interesting means interesting to you, but also interesting to the scientific community. Novel implies that there has to be something that it's bringing into the world of science. What is important, and what is your research question going to add to what's known? Ethical means that it just what it says. It has to be an ethical thing to do. And relevant means, in a sense, it has to have some significance. People have to care about what you want to do. The second framework is the PICOT framework, and that is one that really helps you sort of think about the elements of your research question. So PICOT, we have population, meaning who are you going to be studying? Intervention, if there is an intervention, it means what you will be doing to that population. If it's more of an epidemiological study, it's sometimes referred to as the factor of interest. Then we have what groups are going to be compared within your population. The outcomes, meaning what are you going to measure at the end of the study to be able to say that you had an effect, and then what time frame are you looking at? I'm going to check the Q&A here real quick, and I'm going to answer it, even though Joe's typing an answer, and say yes, you will have access to the handout from this talk. So whenever you're developing a research proposal, the specific aims is by far and away the most important page of that whole proposal. And so you will spend, or you should spend, a lot of time developing the specific aims page. When I was at UNC and I taught a grant writing course, it was a 2-semester course, which means that it met for about 8 months. And over those 8 months, the students would write a grant proposal. And we spent the first 4 months on just this one page, the specific aims page. And then the second 4 months, they developed the rest of the grant proposal. And the reason for that is because you have to have your aims very clear, very precise, and that will lead to a clear proposal. Another really important aspect is that when reviewers read a grant proposal, a large proportion of their impression of your idea comes from the aims page. And that's because it's the first thing that they will read, and in many grant review committees, like at the US NIH, it may be the only thing that the majority of the committee looks at. So at NIH, you would have 3 reviewers. They would read the whole grant proposal. The rest of the 20 or 30 member committee would only be looking at the aims very quickly. The basic elements of the specific aims are that there's usually an introductory section, which is typically 2 to 4 paragraphs. Then there are the aims statements, and very often there are 3 aims, but you could have 1 or up to 4. It really should match what you need to do to be able to accomplish your study, your proposed study. and then a brief overview of how the study is going to be done, either aim by aim or as one overview. And I'm going to explain what I mean by that a little bit more in a moment. And then finally, you have an impact statement, which is a concluding statement at the end. And if you have a question, please go ahead and put it in the question and answer section. That will allow us to be able to address it. And one way to think about the aims is that it's addressing the why, the what, the who, the how, and the where of your proposed project in a very succinct way. So this slide shows just 3 examples of how you could structure an aims page. And I want to emphasize that there's no one right way to write a specific aims page. Even as I'm writing grants, I will vary how I write my specific aims to match the particular study and to figure out the best way to present the information that I'm trying to present. But there is a general structure that works. And I'm showing 3 options here that are related to one another, but slightly different. So if you look across the top, we have an introduction in each of the 3 options. Then in the final paragraph of that introduction, in option 1, we sort of describe the general objectives. Then we move on to describe aim 1 and provide a hypothesis and a brief overview of how we're going to do aim 1, and then repeat that statement, the hypothesis, and the overview for aims 2 and 3. And then we conclude with an impact statement. The difference between option 1 and option 2 is that instead of having hypotheses by each aim, we have something called a central hypothesis. And a central hypothesis means that it allows you to, it's basically an overarching hypothesis of your whole research plan in the proposal. So it would capture basically everything that you're trying to do in a relatively general way, as opposed to a very specific aim by aim kind of way. And then in option 2, we have an overview of the research activities just before the aim statements. Then we provide the aim statements and an impact statement. Option 3 is very similar, except we've moved the overview from before the aims to after the aims. And again, as I said, there's not a right way to do it. It is mostly a function of what conveys the information the best. The overview, I'm just answering the question in the Q&A real quick, was how long does the overview need to be? The overview is really quite short. It's just a couple of sentences. And if it's done in option 1, aim by aim, it really is limited to 2 or 3 sentences. In options 2 and 3, it's a paragraph. And in those cases, it's describing the whole study. So if we look at the introduction paragraphs, we have 1 to 3 paragraphs that introduce the topic, and really you're trying to sell the importance of your idea and your area of research. So just remember that whenever you write a grant proposal, they're part salesmanship, and it's quite different than a manuscript, for example. In a manuscript, you're trying to be very precise and describe what you did in your study, and you're a little bit understated. In a grant, your job is to try and sell the idea and convince the reader that what you're doing is really important and deserves to be funded. And finally, the aims introduction is trying to make what you're planning to do obvious. We'll talk a little bit more about the idea that you never want to surprise a reviewer when they get to the aim statements. So this introduction is really the 2 or 3 most important paragraphs of your entire proposal. So your proposal might be, for example, 13 pages long. That would be a standard NIH length, where you have 1 page for the specific aims and 12 pages for your research ideas. And that 1 page far and away outweighs the other 12. As I said, you have to convince the reader of the significance, and you have to make it very clear and obvious what your project is about. But you only have that 1 page, so every word is precious. On the aims pages, it's very helpful to have what we call topic sentences, and that's a topic sentence is the first sentence of a paragraph that sort of telegraphs the information within a paragraph. And so if you think about it, the very most important sentence of the entire proposal is the first sentence of the aims. That's the first thing that the reviewers are going to read, and it sets the stage for the rest of the document. The next 2 most important sentences are the beginnings of the second and third paragraph of those introductory paragraphs. And finally, the other important paragraphs or sentences right there on your aims page are your aims statements and your hypotheses. And everything else is really filling in the details. So from these 5 or 6 sentences, you are conveying the critical information to the reviewer. When we think about these introductory paragraphs, we can think of them as a funnel. So a funnel starts off broad and goes more narrow, and the same idea comes about in the writing of the paragraphs. So the very first paragraph of your aims is going to be a global statement of the problem, a big picture of what the significance of your work is. And you're addressing the question, what is the public health problem and why is it important? The second paragraph addresses the gap in knowledge and helps us understand why what you're doing is important and how you're filling some gap in what we know. And then the third paragraph is, what are we going to do about it? What's your plan to address that knowledge gap? So in paragraph 1, again, it's a global statement of the problem. And as I had a student once say, it's the paragraph that scares the reader. And what they meant was that by saying how big the problem is, you're convincing the reader that this is a problem that really needs to be addressed. Just make sure that when you're writing this paragraph, that everything that you include directly is relevant to what you're proposing. One of the most common mistakes that people make when writing specific aims page is to include information that is somewhat extraneous or not relevant to the question that you're really trying to address. In the second paragraph, you're addressing the knowledge gap, and by doing that, you're looking at your area of research more directly. And if you have an intervention, you may be addressing why people need that intervention. And this is just more focused on your specific problem than the first paragraph. But again, remember, no extraneous information would be included. Sometimes paragraph 2 is really 2 or even 3 paragraphs. I just describe it as paragraph 2 because it's a little bit easier to think of that way. But don't be afraid to break it into a couple of paragraphs if that helps you describe the gap in knowledge more clearly. The final paragraph is a brief statement of what you plan to do. And sometimes you might include a statement of why your team is the best team for the project. Basically selling that your group is the group of people who should be doing this work. Again, as going back to the options that I showed you before, if you have a central hypothesis, you'll describe it in this last paragraph, and just, again, emphasizing no extraneous information or words. I'm going to just give a example here really quickly of paragraph 1. This is from a study that we have funded here in Vietnam. And I'm just going to read this out loud. I have a couple of other paragraphs that are following. I'm not going to spend as much time on those. So this is the very beginning of a proposal. In Asia, the HIV epidemic has shifted from people who inject drugs to men who have sex with men. In 2021, MSM comprised 43% of new HIV cases in Vietnam. This shift is multifactorial, including low pre-exposure prophylaxis, uptake, and persistence. And in Hanoi, about 50% of MSM stopped PrEP within 6 months. So just from that paragraph, you can see where this grant is going. It's going to be something about MSM and their use of PrEP and their need to be encouraged to remain on PrEP if they have continued risk. I'm not going to go through this whole paragraph, but as you look at the first sentence, you can see that we start with this epidemic shift is also driven by alcohol use, which affects MSM's behavioral decisions and PrEP use. So now you have pretty much an idea of the whole gist of the grant. It's in MSM. It's about getting MSM on PrEP and keeping them on PrEP. And we're going to do something about the fact that alcohol use is highly prevalent in that population. And I'm going to skip through this part and move to the final paragraph where I'm describing what we're proposing to do. And it gives you a sense of the plan, as you'll recall from the funnel. So we propose an effectiveness implementation type 1 hybrid randomized controlled trial to compare the BAI, which is brief alcohol intervention, to standard of care among MSM with unhealthy alcohol use who are initiating or reinitiating oral event-driven or injectable PrEP in Vietnam. So just reading that sentence, if you think back to the PCOT notion for research questions, just that one sentence hits a substantial proportion of the PCOT elements. Then we go on to describe our hypothesis and then move on to the actual aim statements. One thing that's really helpful is something that we call the specific, that I call the paper test, which means that if you were to print out your specific aims page and covered the aim statements at the bottom of the page, if I just read your introductory paragraphs, I should be able to tell you pretty accurately what your aim statements are. And what I mean by that is if I read your introduction, I should be able to predict what you're going to say there and what you're going to do. In other words, you want the reader to anticipate exactly what you're planning to do and not be surprised. If you surprise them, that means you didn't build a justification for that element of your work. When you write an aim statement, so this is the work that you're actually planning to do, you want to write them in a clear, concise, and complete way. And just remember, it's really easy for your aims to feel like they're clear when they're not, and to be much less specific than you want them to be. When you write the aim statements, use active verbs to describe what you're going to do. Something like compare or measure or describe or adapt or evaluate. If you have an exploratory aim, it's okay to be clear about that. Sometimes people like to shy away from exploration because it's not hypothesis driven, but there are times when an aim that is exploratory is totally fine. Scientifically, aims that are too dependent on one another can be a problem. So what I mean by that is if one aim were to fail, like if aim one didn't succeed and you couldn't proceed with the subsequent aim, then the aims are too dependent. You in any study, you should be able to do the all three aims, even if one of the aims is unsuccessful. In general, the scope of the project as reflected in the aim statements has to match the funding available in whatever type of grant that you're doing. So for example, if you're developing a trial as opposed to starting a full trial, then the aim should focus on the development of the intervention, and there'll be some sort of pilot study. If you're writing a larger award, then it has to be either a trial or an observational study of substantial size. And if you're writing more of a career development award, then it should have the appropriate training and relevant research activities. So in another this is an implementation science study. These are examples of what our aim statements look like. So the first one is a statement of the actual randomized controlled trial to compare standard implementation mapping to tailored implementation mapping to scale up SNAP and HIV test sites in Vietnam. SNAP is the evidence-based intervention being scaled up in this implementation science trial. And then second one, to measure the incremental costs of implementation mapping compared to tailored intervention mapping for SNAP implementation in Vietnam. And finally, to explore the key characteristics of high and low performing test sites for implementation. So from those, you can get a sense of what aim statements look like. This is for an R34, which is a type of grant, which is a intervention development grant. And in this case, if you just look at the first aim here, it's to adapt the friendship bench, which is a type of intervention that's been used in other settings, to be optimized for people living with HIV in Vietnam. And finally, for a K43, which is a type of career development award, this just gives you a sense of the scope that you might have in a career development award. So it's looking at mental health needs. This is also adapting the friendship bench for a different group of people. And then finally, to assess its performance in a small pilot study, not a full-scale study. And the reason for that is that for a career development award, you have a relatively small amount of funding. And so you have to keep your scope of work very small. In general, hypothesis-driven work is going to be viewed as stronger. And remember that hypotheses can either be specific to each aim or more global and stated more clearly in the introduction. When you have a central hypothesis, meaning an overarching hypothesis, it's usually given in the last paragraph before the aims, and it covers the overall goal of the study, meaning that it's like a guiding hypothesis that will be addressed by completing all of the aims of the study. So here's an example of what I mean by a central hypothesis. We hypothesize that compared to standard intervention mapping, tailored intervention mapping will increase site fidelity, increase PWI, people who inject drugs, antiretroviral therapy uptake, and be cost effective. So it's covering all the elements of the aims of that particular grant. When you use aim by aim hypotheses, basically give one of them after each aim and set them off on a new line with hypothesis. You usually only want one hypothesis per aim and definitely not more than two. And if you can't specify a hypothesis for each aim, for example, let's say you have a lot of qualitative data collection, which is generally not suitable for hypothesis-driven type questions, then it's better to have a central hypothesis rather than trying to do it aim by aim. I mentioned having an overview in the specific aim structure. And again, that can be aim by aim, or that can be done overall. It's basically just a brief description of how you're going to accomplish each aim. And it will describe in a couple of sentences the study design, the intervention or the factor of interest that you're looking at the outcomes very briefly. This is a little bit long, so I'm not going to try to go through it all, but at the beginning of it is the aim statement where it says to compare standard implementation mapping, blah, blah, blah. And then if you read through the next part, this is our overview. We will conduct a 2-arm, pragmatic, cluster randomized implementation trial among HIV test sites in Vietnam. And then it goes on to describe it in some limited detail, but enough for a reader to understand the basics of what this trial is going to look like. And the specific aims conclude with an impact statement. So at the end of your aims page, consider adding a paragraph that basically answers the question, what will the world gain by funding this proposal? And in doing so, be specific and don't overpromise, and make it useful, make it show the world just what is going to be gained. So this is again for that implementation science trial called SNAP. And we first make the claim that we're a good group to do it, and then we make the case that if this is successful, it will help ministries of health implement an evidence-based intervention more broadly. So how do you know when your specific aims are done? When they've addressed these questions. Why is the topic important? How will your research advance knowledge? What gap will be filled? What are you going to do? Where will you do it? And how will you do it? And just finally, remember that the aims are the most important part of any grant, even when they're called objectives instead of aims. Also remember, space is limited, so every word on this page is chosen carefully and it has to do its job. So no extraneous information. Be sure to tell the story of why your work is important in those introduction paragraphs, and give enough information about what you're going to do to allow the reader to judge the feasibility and value of the proposed research. So thank you very much. I'm going to just click on the questions here and see if there's ones that we need to justify. So is there a difference between aims introduction and the justification of the study? No, not really. Those within the aims introduction, you're justifying the purpose of the study. About the interdependence of the aims, does this mean that a project that seeks to develop together with stakeholders and evaluate such an intervention would be considered as having 2 interdependent aims? How to balance this? Well, in a circumstance where you're trying to work with stakeholders to develop a project, the critical part is that you have something at the end. If it's possible that you work with stakeholders and they say, this project is never going to work, we can't do it, then that's a problem. But if there's always going to be something that comes out of that work with the stakeholders that you can then move forward, then they aren't too interdependent. You used references sparingly in your example. What's best to cite in the aims page? And this is actually an interesting question, more interesting than you might imagine. There's one large school of people who write grants who never cite anything on an aims page, who just basically say, if it's on the aims page, it should be sufficiently obvious that you don't need a citation. I don't agree with that. Basically, when you're making your citations on the aims page, you should use the most appropriate citation. So it might be the seminal paper. That's a great one to be citing. It might be a systematic review if there's been quite a bit of work done and you're using it. The key thing, though, is to cite the paper that makes the most sense for that work. The aim statement are the same as the objective. It really depends on the mechanism of the grant that you're proposing. The US NIH does not use the term objective, they use aims instead. Would it be okay to include references to previous work made by our research team in the introduction section? Yes, absolutely. In fact, you often want to be advertising, promoting your own work in that space. And the grant that I was showing many examples of, called SNAP, actually is based on work that our group had done previously. And that was a big part of our claim to we're the right people to do this grant. What is the standard margins for an NIH grant? So an NIH grant basically is written with Arial 11-point font with 1/2-inch margins. What about the definition of concepts and terms? We would like to avoid surprises by defining everything clearly. On the other hand, space is limited in that one page. Yes, that's a very important point. So if you're introducing something that will be new to reviewers, then you really have to define it. Or if you're using something a little bit differently than people might otherwise use it, you would have to define it. But you can also at the same time trust that the review committee will largely be people that are at least somewhat familiar with the general area of what you're working on. They may not be experts on your specific topic, but they will be familiar in general. What if you don't have preliminary data? How do you work around that? So for those of you that aren't aware, most grants have supporting data that helps you convince the readers, that the reviewers, that you're going to be able to do this work. If you don't have preliminary data, then most typically what you have to do is write a smaller grant to be able to get preliminary data. A bigger grant like an NIH R01, just to give you a sense of that scope, that's about $500,000 a year for 5 years ish. And if you don't have preliminary data, you basically won't be able to get that funded. But the way to get there is to write a smaller grant, which is maybe an R03, which is $50,000 for 2 years to get that preliminary data. Or you write an R21, which is essentially up to $250,000 over 2 years. A talk on, it would be easy to give a talk just like this on what constitutes preliminary data and how to use that section effectively, because that section is probably the second most important one after the specific aims. Is there a relation between the specific aims and the methodology of the research? Yes, of course. So the specific aims are, that page is both building the case for what you're doing, as well as building a case for your approach and how you're going to do it. It should be fairly clear by the end of the aims page just what you're doing and why you've chosen that approach. Is there a way to navigate through the interdependence of aims? I mentioned the interdependence because that's something that many reviewers will criticize, but most of the time it's not that difficult. When you propose what you're planning to do, it will come pretty naturally and it will make sense. The only thing you want to avoid is having aims 2 and 3 so dependent on aim 1 that if aim 1 fails in year 1, that you're not going to be able to do anything for the rest of the grant period. And most of the time, that's not the case. Like your biggest aim will come first, and if that doesn't succeed, it might not be as big of a problem. If definitions are required, that would be in the intro, the top bit of the funnel, or the global overview, and then narrow it down to the definitions. Usually, if you need definitions, it will be most likely in sort of the middle part of the funnel. The first part of the funnel where it's like really global, you're usually talking about the big picture issues. Now, sometimes maybe the big picture issue is something like stigma, as an example, and you want to give a definition for stigma. That would be totally fine to include the definition in the first paragraph. In other words, there's not specific rules here. It's largely match where you put things to where it best conveys the information. I see in the overview the word "or." It means you anticipate alternatives from the beginning. Is it well seen or expected? I'm not sure I fully understand that question, but in general, you do. There will, not usually on the Ames page, but there will be a page or a part of the grant later where you're describing people's or alternatives if something doesn't go right. And I think that is all of the questions.
Thanks so much, Bill. That was fantastic. We will be archiving the video, and as Dr. Miller mentioned, we'll also put the PowerPoint presentation onto the website. So if you joined late or just want to look back, both of those references will be available. Dr. Miller also kindly shared a separate PDF that really goes into more granular detail into all parts of an NIH grant application and gives sort of tips and pointers, and that'll be on the website. So great. Big round of applause. Thanks again, Dr. Miller. And our next talk for the series will be on the 28th in 1 week. Dr. Iwalunmore will be talking to us about the innovation section of an NIH grant. So thanks again, Dr. Miller.
Thanks, everyone. Good luck with your grant writing.